So welcome back, the few, the proud, the tough, the people that want to see the end of David, or end of Saul. Today is February 23rd, but it was on this date in 155 that Polycarp died. Polycarp was one of the transitional people between the New Testament church and the early church. He was a student of John. That is John, as in John the Apostle, and he later took on Irenaeus, who was one of the first great leaders of these first, in the 100s church in the Bible. So Polycarp. So it's always when you start talking about the Bible, because Irenaeus was one of the first guys to start writing and saying these are the inspired books of the Bible, and say, well, what does Irenaeus know? Well, he was a student of Polycarp, who was a student of John, the Apostle John. On this date in 362, Athanasius returns to Alexandria. Athanasius is, again, another one of the heroes of the first century church. Athanasius was excommunicated 5 times, which has always been my goal in life, that I want to be excommunicated. And I don't want to, not just 5 times. This guy, he'd go in, he'd keep coming back, he'd go in, he'd keep coming back. 5 times, and is significant in the development of the biblical canon that we know. He was part of the council that kind of put together the biblical canon. So he's a big guy in church history. His nickname was Athanasius Contra Mundum, Athanasius against the world, kind of thing. So that was in 362. In 1173, Thomas à Becket was canonized, became a saint. Thomas à Becket, the Archbishop of Canterbury, who went against the king. And the story there is that, as I recall, this is the one where the king says, "Would someone rid me of this winsome priest?" And 2 guys took him seriously and broke into the what do you call the building? Cathedral at Canterbury, and killed him. And if you go there to the Cathedral of Canterbury, which we have, there's a spot where this is where Thomas à Becket was killed, and there's this is the door they came through, and this is the spot, and there's a small museum where you can watch a video, like a cartoon video and stuff like that about him. It's also there's a famous movie made of that. I think it's just called Becket. But it stars like Peter O'Toole and Richard Burton and kind of that sort of a thing. On this day in 1680, Thomas Goodwin died, a famous nonconformist English pastor, good friends with John Owen. If you know anything about John Owen, if you're a fan of the Puritan Reformed, John Owen was a great writer. In fact, one year, I forget who the youth pastor was, but they were going through a book written by John Owen called The Mortification of the Flesh, which I always thought that was kind of interesting. What's our youth group studying? The Mortification of the Flesh. Great. Were you in on that one, Charlie? No. In 1758, Jonathan Edwards received the smallpox vaccination. He died a month later, so take that for anyone. But back in the 1750s, in the 18th century, the vaccine idea was relatively new. And when they say they took a vaccination, what they literally would do they would find somebody with smallpox, and again, as I understand it, there's like pus-filled things and boils and the like, and they would lance one of those, and they would cut the guy's arm, or the person's arm, and they would just scrape it off there and put it in this open wound. And that was their idea of a vaccination. And it was fairly successful for the time. I mean, it had like a 75% success rate, which meant 25% of the people, like Jonathan Edwards, died, or at least got a full-blown case of what do you call it, of smallpox. And when they really figured it out, when they figured out how to get rid of smallpox, it was because they discovered that there was another disease, cowpox, they called it, that had the same created the same antibodies or whatever. What do you go? I don't know. Can you tell that science wasn't my forte here? Medical science, not my strong point. But that was on this date in 1758. In 1842, the first known sewing machine was patented in Washington D.C. by John Greenough, which and sewing machines have a big part in my dating life, because like the first girl I ever asked out on a date when I was in college was somebody who was I believe she was a home ec major. It wasn't Debbie. Um, but I believe it was a home ec major, and so we were doing the whole initial talking, and she mentioned in the course of that conversation that she had purchased, just before leaving for school, she had purchased a new sewing machine and had paid $1,000 for it. And I was incredulous that you could spend $1,000 on a sewing machine. And so I was like, you got to be kidding me. I'm giving her a hard time about spending $1,000 on a sewing machine. And we never went out again. So after that, I learned that when Debbie says she spent any amount of money on anything, I go, oh, how interesting. Kind of stuff. I learned my lesson there. But yeah, I just remember that because it just seems so outlandish to me that you would spend $1,000 on a sewing machine. But that's neither here nor there. But Alka-Seltzer was invented in 1931. Plop, plop, fizz, fizz. Oh, whatever. How many? Let's see. I can't believe I ate the whole thing. Same year. It was the same year that the Chicago White Sox and the New York Giants played their first exhibition night game. 1931. So I don't know whether they won or not. That's, I guess, would be a good thing to know. In 1965, Malcolm X was assassinated. He was assassinated in New York City, in a church in New York City, on this date. Nixon traveled to China on this date in 1972. And finally, some of you may remember this event, not a high point of Christianity, but it was on this date in 1988 that Jimmy Swaggart confessed to his congregation about his sin. I don't know if you remember that. How many remember that? The I have sinned. Yeah, that was a great moment. But there were quite a few, in a short period of time there in the 80s, the late 80s, where quite a few of these guys were falling hard and falling fast. The pattern hasn't seemed to stop, but that was it. So, all right, that's all that happened on this date on February 23rd. So today we're going to talk about 1 Samuel 30 and 31. We're going to end this first part. We'll see the end of the life of King Saul. All right, I've not hidden the fact that Debbie and I both enjoy going to Shakespeare plays, and there has been a lot of Shakespeare quotations in this one because, again, Shakespeare writes a lot about kings and their rise and their fall, and obviously when you're looking at the Book of Samuel, you're talking about the rise and fall of a couple of kings. And today made me think of a speech, and it's probably my favorite Shakespeare speech. Okay, my favorite Shakespearean monologue, and you all know about one or two monologues. To be or not to be, that is a question. That's one of Shakespeare's monologues. But in Shakespeare's play Richard II, Richard II is about King Richard, who was the grandson of Edward III. Edward III, we talked about in What Happened on This Day a while back. He was king of England for about 50 years, had a son who was like everybody's idea of what a king should be. His name was Black Prince. He was also named Edward. He was called the Black Prince, but he died when he was 44 years old. He probably would have been king had Edward died earlier, but Edward didn't. And so when Edward did die, his son Richard became king and was given Richard II. And he was deposed. There was a coup of sorts, and he was replaced by Henry of Bolingbroke, who later was, when he became king, was called Henry IV. Henry Bolingbroke was his cousin. He was also a grandson of Edward III, but his father was John of Gaunt, who's another character. You ever see the play Richard II? It's a great play. Not a lot of action in it, but it's a great play. But he's deposed and he's put in prison. He's and he knows he's doomed. And there's a great scene where he just starts reflecting on his life and the nature of being a king. And the speech is something like this. It's Richard II, Act 3, Scene 2. No matter where of comfort no man speak, let's talk of graves, of worms and epitaphs, make dust our paper, and with rainy eyes write sorrow on the bosom of the earth. Let's choose executors and talk of wills, and yet not so, for what can we bequeath, save our deposed bodies to the ground? Our lands, our lives, and all our Bolingbroke's, and nothing can we call our own but death. This is Richard speaking of Bolingbroke has taken his kingdom. And nothing we can call our own but death, and that small model of the barren earth, which serves as paste and cover to our bones. For God's sake, let us sit upon the ground and tell sad stories of the death of kings. How some have been deposed, some slain in war, some haunted by the ghosts they have deposed, some poisoned by their wives, some sleeping killed, all murdered, for within the hollow crown that rounds the mortal temples of a king keeps death his court, and there the antic sits, etc., etc. It goes on and on. There's a British series called The Hollow Crown that talks about the kingdom. And as I think about this passage today, I was reminded of that scene um, with Saul, thinking about the fact that the Lord had told him, Samuel had told him that, you're toast, you're out of here. And yet he goes on and starts, does his duty. And last week we talked about 1 Samuel 27 through 29, with desperate men doing desperate things. We have David going to Ziklag, going over to the Philistines, and then we have Saul seeking out the witch at Endor. And the thing to remember as we look at this last scene in this book, Samuel 27 through 31, that these two stories are happening simultaneously. So, the writer goes back and forth, and it's really kind of well placed. He goes back and forth, but the stories are taking place at the same time, but in different locations, different spaces. And so, in chapter 30, beginning with verse 1, says, David and his men reached Ziklag on the third day. So if you remember, David had gone up with Saul, with Achish the king, and it said, I'm here to fight. And the other Philistine ruler said, whoa, 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 not that guy. We don't want him. And so they're like, let someone else is going to have, get rid of this guy, because they're going to turn on us. Because that's what the Hebrews had done before. When it looked like the Israelites were winning, the Hebrews turned. And for all we know, that might have been David's plan. Okay, it's hard to believe that David would have actually fought against the Israelites, although he did give all indications that he was planning on it. But so they get rid of him, and Achish the king says to him, you have been like an angel of God to me. Even though David has been lying to him about what he's been doing, he says, go back to the town of Achish. Okay, and so David leaves the town of Achish, or leaves Achish and is traveling back to Ziklag. And then the Philistines are mustering. That's when when Saul sees sees the assembled armies. Saul is terrified. He leaves and goes and finds the witch at Endor. So while David is traveling back to Ziklag, and perhaps as he arrives at Ziklag, Saul is at the witch of Endor's house, and he's staying there for a day to get fed and all that event. Okay, and so kind of, again, I'm just sort of speculating how they happened, but it seems pretty close that around the time that David gets to David gets to his town of Ziklag, Saul is at the witch of Endor. Okay, and when David leaves Ziklag, which we'll talk about in a minute, Saul leaves the witch at Endor and goes back to. And it kind of appears that David is in battle against the Amalekites at the same time Saul is at battle against the Philistines. So these stories are going on at the same time, not separated by that far by today's standards. I mean, they're only 25, 30 miles apart. And so today you think, well, just run on over there. It's like, well, they would literally have to run on over there. So that's like a two-day journey. So David is sent back to Ziklag, and he discovers there something. Now the Amalekites had raided the Negev and Ziklag. They had attacked Ziklag and burned it, and had taken captive the women and everything else in it, both young and old. They killed none of them, but carried them off as they went on their way. So David and his men take 3 days to return to Ziklag, where they discover the Amalekites had attacked, taken everything, wives too, and escaped. Okay, now there's all sorts of things to think about here. It's the Amalekites. Okay, now had Saul done his job back in chapter 15, this may not have ever happened, because he was supposed to destroy the Amalekites, and he didn't. And so the Amalekites are, and we're going to see an odd Amalekite come back up again when we get into 2 Samuel. Although the Amalekites as a group are pretty much disappear from the narrative of the Old Testament for quite some time. They do show up a few generations later as one of a group of armies, but as far as being a significant threat, they disappear after today's events. When David and his men reached Ziklag, they found it destroyed by fire, and their wives and sons and daughters taken captive. So David and his men, wept aloud until they had no strength left to weep. Okay, so they traveled for 3 days. They get there, they realize what happens, and they go into hysterics, and they're weeping, and they're distraught because they've lost everything. Okay, so much so that they had no strength left to weep. David's 2 wives had been captured. Notice he's not counting Michal anymore. David's 2 wives had been captured, Ahinoam of Jezreel and Abigail, the widow of Nabal of Carmel. David was greatly distressed because the men were talking of stoning him. It's interesting that one of the reasons why some scholars believe that David's moment here is the same as Saul's moment at the witch at Endor is because when he says David was greatly distressed, that's the same phrase used to describe Saul's feeling that led him to going to the witch at Endor. So the same description of how they are. And David is greatly distressed because now his men, the 600 men that he has around him, are talking of stoning him. Okay. Now, it's not in the text, but just take a side note here that apparently it seems pretty clear that David didn't leave anyone there to guard Ziklag. Okay. Now, this kind of becomes important later, but just note that, okay? Because they just came in and helped themselves to everything, burned the buildings, took off back again, okay? David was greatly distressed because of the situation, and there in 28:5 is where Saul is described. It's translated differently, but it's the same Hebrew word, that Saul was greatly distressed when he saw the size of the Philistine army. And if you remember, we know what changed is Saul believes that David is a part of the Philistine army. Okay, because they're not sending messages back and forth. And, oh, by the way, David's not playing on our side anymore. They don't have to show the lineup cards before the game starts, kind of thing. Okay. David was greatly distressed. Each one was bitter in spirit because of his sons and daughters. And this is understandable. I mean, you're fighting with this guy, and all of a sudden, because he didn't leave anyone to guard, and he goes off following the enemy, he's thrown in his lot, and so we're with him, so we've thrown in our lot with the Philistines, and now look what it got us. We've lost everything, okay? But here we see one of the great differences between Saul and David, and it says that David found strength in the Lord his God. David found strength in the Lord his God. So David was able to look at these situations and realize that perhaps there's a bright light to this, or there's light. This cloud has a silver lining. That's the phrase I'm looking for. Okay, he's like there might be something good there, that something can be done out of it. He finds strength in the Lord his God. Uh, then David said to Abiathar the priest, the son of Ahimelech, "Bring me the ephod." Abiathar brought it to him, and David inquired of the Lord. Okay, Saul also inquired of the Lord. Okay, maybe at the same time, and this is where he's not, the Lord is not responding to Saul. Maybe it's because he's busy responding to David. I don't know. I think the Lord is capable of responding to more than one at the same time. But again, there's these parallels that kind of make you think, oh, this is, it would be interesting to think that, if I were filming this as a movie, there'd be a cutting that David and Saul would be doing it, inquiring of the Lord at the exact same time. Okay, if I was the director, that's how it would be shot. Okay, I'm just saying. Okay, if anybody's watching and wants me, basically, it says to direct a movie, this is how I would do it. Um, excuse me. Okay. So he inquires of the Lord, "Shall I pursue this raiding party? Will I overtake them?" Okay. So David found strength in the Lord, his God. David inquired of the Lord, who confirmed his plan. Okay. And the Lord says, "Pursue them." He answered, "You will certainly overtake them and succeed in the rescue." Okay. So even with that, the Lord is telling David something, that, there's something to rescue there. You're not just getting vengeance, but there's going to be something to rescue. Okay. So clearly, if the Amalekites had wanted to kill everybody, they would have just done it then. Why carry them off? And again, why would they do that? Okay, maybe they're looking for wives and kids. Okay, that's been done before in the Bible, where they come in and capture a bunch of women. Um, there are easier ways to find a wife, but I'm just saying it's been done. Or perhaps they were just planning on selling them into slavery. That's been done as well too. Okay, but we don't know why. But the Amalekites have taken everyone. It says, "Go, you're going to be successful in this thing." Now, notice, if you remember the last time David inquired of the Lord before the battle, and I think it's in chapter 23. I got the text. Let's see, where is it here? The ultimate. No, David pursues. Note this time, compared to chapter 23, 1-5, his men don't object. You remember the last time David inquired of the Lord, and he said, "Okay, yeah, go ahead." And the men go, "Whoa, whoa, 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 wait a minute. We're not 100% certain of this." This time they don't object. Okay, maybe that's what they figured they were going to do, and of course their wives and daughters are on the line. Sons are on the line as well. So David and his 600 men with him came to the Bezor Valley, where some stayed behind. 200 of them were too exhausted to cross the valley, but David and the other 400 continued the pursuit. Okay. Now here you see David saying, "Okay." Now if you think about it, they drove 2 days, or they drove 3 days, rode 3 days back from Ziklag, or back to Ziklag. They get to Ziklag. They mourn and weep so much, and the text tells us that they had no strength left. Now they get back up on their horses or their camels or whatever, and they travel another day or so. And so there's about 200 of them that just, "I can't go any further." Okay. And David says, "All right, and we find out later, you stand back here and guard the baggage." So David leaves someone to guard the stuff. Okay. Whatever they had. Okay. And the 400, now he's got 400 of his men to go on. And I don't, this isn't a situation like with Gideon, where he starts with 10,000 and then goes down to 3,000 and then goes down to 300, or whatever the numbers are. But it's just a question of, these guys, they're not going to be any good in the battle. So you stay here, guard the luggage, and the 400 that can still travel on will continue. But David and the other 400. They found an Egyptian in a field and brought him to David. They gave him water and food to eat, part of a cake of pressed figs and 2 cakes of raisins. He ate and was revived, for he had not eaten any food or drunk any water for 3 days and 3 nights. Okay, so again, this tracks because, if you think about how long they're traveling and all that, it's okay. So last time he ate was just before the battle at Ziklag. Okay, but they don't know yet that he's an Egyptian. Okay, to David, it's just a guy on the side of the road. Now, maybe from looking at him, maybe his clothing was such that they could tell he was an Egyptian, but he was an Amalekite slave. Okay, so, and we're going to find this out in a minute. I'm just, um, I doubt that in that day and era that they were that concerned that their slaves wore clothing representative of whatever their history or ethnicity was. But regardless, they find this guy. He's on the road. They just find this guy on the side of a road. So there's 400 of them. They find this guy on the side of the road. They know he didn't come from the direction they're coming from. So they figure he must know something that's ahead. So they stop their pursuit and wait for this guy to get revived. Okay, so it's kind of interesting to compare this to not the prodigal son, the Good Samaritan. Okay, there's this guy on the side of the road. They're on a mission. They've got something to do. They need to get somewhere. But wait, there's a guy on the side of the road. Let's all stop, feed this guy, wait for him to eat. Okay, now David's men are not the kindest group of guys. I don't think they're the most patient group of guys. But can you imagine the grumbling that was going on at this point amongst his men while this Egyptian guy is sitting here eating and drinking and all? I mean, he hasn't eaten for 3 days and 3 nights. So I can imagine he's I go 3 hours without eating and drinking, and I'm like, hey, this guy had gone 3 days. David asked him, who do you belong to? Where do you come from? He said, I'm an Egyptian, the slave of an Amalekite. My master abandoned me when I became ill 3 days ago. We raided the Negev of the Kerethites, some territory belonging to Judah, and the Negev of Caleb, and we burned Ziklag. Okay. Now, it's interesting that he may not know who he's talking to. Then again, maybe he does. Okay. He knows that the guy has waited and fed him. If they were going to kill him, they would have just killed him. Okay. He doesn't know who he's talking to, but he's saying, okay, this is what I've done. Okay. Now, it kind of suggests that the Amalekites knew they needed to get moving. Okay. Because the slave, now I don't know how valuable he was, but still, if you look at it simply from an economic point of view, there was some value in a slave. And they'd pretty much given up on this guy and say waiting for this guy or taking the time to wait for this guy to recover or feed him wasn't worth it. So that, yeah, you're going to die anyway. Just stay. We're going to continue on. Okay. Clearly, they had to get over that, or maybe this guy just didn't like him or whatever. Just said, you're going to die. Just stay on the side of the road. It says, David asked him, can you lead me down to this raiding party? Do you know where they were going? And, it's pretty clear that the Amalekites came from somewhere, came into the area, turned around and went back. Okay, so yeah, I know he knows where they are. And that's a reasonable expectation that David asks. Okay, so it says let's see this. They ultimately come upon a man on the side of the road, and Luke 10:25. That's the story of the Good Samaritan. He's an Egyptian slave and will help, but only if they don't tell on him. He answered, verse 15, he answered, swear to me before God that you will not kill me or hand me over to my master, and I will take you down to them. Now see, because he's dead to his master, right? He's dead. The master thought he was dead, so go ahead. And so he said, but don't turn, because now that he's revived, it's like, well, wait a minute, my master may want me back. Okay. So David says, swear to me. And apparently David says yes. He says he led David down, and there they were, scattered over the countryside, eating, drinking, and reveling because of the great amount of plunder they had taken from the land of the Philistines and from Judah. So, I kind of get the idea that they come over, sneak over a hill, and you see the heads. Again, I'm pretending how I'm going to film this. The heads popping up. There they are, and they're all just they've reached their safe point. They think they've reached their safe area, and they're all just kind of relaxing, sitting around. Who knows? Maybe the plunder and the wives and the kids are all over in this pen over there, and they're just sitting there, enjoying the food, drink, that they've succeeded. But it says David and his men, of course, fought them from dusk until the evening of the next day. So dusk means evening. So this fight lasts at least 24 hours. Okay, so this is a long battle that David and his men are getting into, and they end up wiping out all of the Amalekites except, and this is just kind of odd, none of them got away except 400 young men who rode off on camels and fled. Other translations call them 400 lads get up on a camel and flee. So I don't know. This is one of those interesting little things that's in the text. You go, okay, what did these 400 young men show up somewhere else? Is there some other legend about the 400 young men that have disappeared? And so, but they get away. So the slave leads them to the Amalekites, where they fight for at least 24 hours. David, verse 18, David recovered everything the Amalekites had taken, including his 2 wives. Okay? Nothing was missing, young or old, boy or girl, plunder or anything else that they had taken. David brought everything back. Okay? So David and all recover everything. Nothing was missing. However, 400 young men escape on camels. Just, 400 young men. Now, remember when I said earlier that this is, I didn't think that this was a good idea. That this was not the best idea for David. Now, if you think on a timeline, while David is fighting the Amalekites, I believe is when Saul is fighting the Philistines. Okay, so I kind of like to think that the moment David realizes he's won is the moment that Saul dies. That these stories are going on at the same time. Okay, but I said that it's not that God wanted David to be the king, and God was going to protect David and make sure he got to be the king. Okay, and so David was desperate at that point and wasn't inquiring of the Lord. But here, this kind of illustrates that the Lord is capable and was certainly capable of protecting David had he stayed with the Philistines, had he stayed in Judah, because this was God's will, God's sovereign will, that David become the king. Okay, and he lost nothing. Okay, the fact that everything was recovered, to me, is miraculous in that God said, listen, I'm just, to me, this is an object lesson to David. Say, look, I can protect your people without you in the midst of the enemy. Okay, so I don't know, there might be a lesson there that when we think that we have to control everything and we don't trust God to protect our own, we think we have to be there, we have to be on top of things. God is telling David, listen, not a thing, everything is saved. You brought back everything. Okay, so I kind of think I just have this idea in my head, because again, I've got this alternate universe in my head, that there's actually Marvel started doing it, and there was a series of history writers that did this what if kind of series of books, and what if Hitler had not invaded Russia? What if Hitler had won the war? What if this? What if that? How would that have been different? Okay, what if John Wilkes Booth had missed and not killed Lincoln? What if Oswald had not killed John F. Kennedy? How would things have been different? Okay, and then the Marvel universe, which for those of you who don't know, that's the Avengers and all those guys. They did a series where what if this, what if that, kind of a whole series of these alternate alternate universes. So I've got this what if, what if David had stayed in Judah and the Philistine army had massed up. Saul was still out. Saul was still going to, maybe it would have been a tremendous victory. Saul may have still died, but he would have died in a victorious battle. David would have been there. It would have been a sad moment, but David was victorious, the leader of the army. It would have been obvious that he would be the next king, and the transition to the kingdom would have been much smoother than it turned out to be. Okay, that's just my speculation. Okay, but God showed, hey, you know what? If I can protect two wives and the wives and children of all of 600 of you, surely I can take care in the midst of the enemy. Surely I can take care of you, right? So I think there's just a lot there in the fact that God protected David's wives without David's help. Okay, so be that as it may. Moving on. He says David brought everything back. He took all the flocks and herds, and his men drove them ahead of the other livestock, saying, "This is David's plunder." Because again, they captured a lot of other stuff too. Okay, because they were in a lot of other places other than Ziklag, and David just took everything back. Okay, so this suggests, not noted in the text, that God was capable of protecting David and others. So he's got all of this stuff coming back. Then David came to the 200 men who had been too exhausted to follow him and were left behind at the Bezer Valley. They came out to meet David and the men with him. As David and his men approached, he asked them how they were. Okay, so, David is in his first concern. Hey, are you guys okay? You guys better? But all of the evil men and troublemakers among David's followers said, because they did not go out with us, we will not share with them the plunder we recovered. However, each man may take his wife and children and go. Okay. So again, David is not fighting with, the top of the line army groups. Remember earlier in chapter 22, they've been described as all of the distressed, in debt, or discontented, was how his army was described in chapter 22. Okay. Now, this is not an unreasonable thing, right? I mean, these 200 guys back here didn't risk their lives. Okay. They were sitting here protecting the thing. But again, who knows? Maybe had all 600 come, somebody would have stolen the baggage. So now David is leaving something to guard, which he didn't do at Ziklag. Okay. And so, but they're like, wait a minute, these guys, why should we share with them? Okay. David now suddenly starts to act like a king. Okay. He's starting to make rules and procedures and processes. He says, David replied, "No, my brothers, you must not do that with what the Lord has given us." Clearly, David understands this is something that the Lord has given us. We didn't do this, the Lord did. Okay. He has protected us and delivered into our hands the raiding party that came out against us. Who will listen to what you say? The share of the man who stayed with the supplies is to be the same as that of him who went down to the battle. All will share alike. David made this a statute and ordinance for Israel from that day to this. Okay. So again, he's saying, this is how there's going to be an equitable distribution. We're going to, we're not just a bunch of raiders. We have a higher purpose here. Okay. So he's starting to act like a king. Okay. On his return, evil men and troublemakers in David's army object to sharing any of the plunder they obtained. David started acting like a king, establishing, you can use processes or procedures, in either one is fine, for this kind of thing. Okay. So when David reached Ziklag, he sent this is kind of an interesting thing. Now, David gets back to Ziklag. Now, by this time, it's almost certain that Saul is dead. In my opinion, it's almost certain that Saul is dead here at this point. So Israel doesn't have a king. When David reached Ziklag, he sent away some of the plunder to the elders of Judah, who were his friends, saying, "Here is a gift for you from the plunder of the Lord's enemies. Hey, let me share a little bit with y'all." Okay. Now these guys, these friends of his, had done nothing in this battle either. Now maybe they had sent men or were part of the battle with the Philistines. Maybe the Philistines had wiped some of them out, and this was a welcome gift at the time. But he starts listing. David sent it to those who were in Bethel, Ramoth Negev, and Jatir, to those in Ariar, Sifmoth, Eshtemoa, and Rachel, to those in the towns of the Jeremielites and the Kenites, to those in Hormah, Bor Ashan, Aztak, and Hebron, and to those in all the other places where he and his men had roamed. Okay, so everybody, I think, that David knew who had helped David receive some of the plunder. And I think that had things turned a little, but going back into what if, that if Nabal had been a little kinder, a little nicer, a little less surly and mean, his name would have been on this list as well. Okay, so that kind of suggests that when I said back when we were talking about in chapter 28 about Nabal and Abigail, that David was just making a reasonable request that others had done for him. This is how he pays them back. Okay, but as somebody who knows he needs some future support, it's a fairly wise political move as well. It's like, hey, I've got a lot. Let me share with you all. Let me share with you. The battle that King Saul was leading may have been a bust, and we're going to find out it was. But mine was successful, so let me share with you what I got, what I obtained. David also, so David asking the king, David also starts cementing current/future alliances with the plunder. Based on 30:31, it's likely Nabal would, had he lived, been on this list. Okay, so David is looking to the future here. Again, this is a to me, it's a politically astute, very kind move. He doesn't have to share with anybody, but it's a politically astute move, the kind of thing that somebody who's looking out for the good of the whole country, like a, what's the word I'm looking for, king, would do. Okay, so we see David kind of looking beyond simply his little band of evil men and troublemakers. Okay. Meanwhile, chapter 31, the Philistines fought against Israel. Meanwhile, Saul is busy fighting the Philistines. So again, now we've gone back in time. Now the battle, Saul has left the witch at Endor. He's been fed. He's come up to the Mount Gilboa. He's leading this fight against this huge army of Philistines, something he has done his entire kingdom, his entire reign, I should say, during the length of his entire kingdom. Now the Philistines fought against Israel. The Israelites fled before them, and many fell dead on Mount Gilboa. The Philistines were in hot pursuit of Saul and his sons, and they killed his sons Jonathan, Abinadab, and Malchishua. So it stands to reason that his sons were in the advanced group, sort of protecting the thing. And again, Jonathan is the greatest of all time here. Okay, Jonathan knows that he's not going to be king. Jonathan knows that his dad's kingdom is doomed. Yet he's out there fighting anyway. Okay, he doesn't know when, he doesn't know where. He just knows it's doomed, but he's out there fighting anywhere. So the Philistines succeed in killing 3 of Saul's sons, including Jonathan. Let's have a moment of silence for Jonathan. Sad to see Jonathan go. I like Jonathan. Jonathan is the unsung hero of the book of Samuel. Nothing bad is said about Jonathan. I mean, we talk a lot about, nothing bad is said about Joseph and several others. Nothing bad is said about Jonathan either. Okay, should have been king. Okay, had his father followed what the Lord wanted him, Jonathan should have been king. Okay, instead he dies in a battle protecting a doomed king. The fighting grew fierce around Saul, and when the archers overtook him, they wounded him critically. The Philistines succeed in killing 3 of Saul's sons, including Jonathan. Saul may or may not be mortally wounded. And I say that because there's a minority translation. I think it might be the Masoretic text or one thing. where the word that's translated mortally wounded can actually be translated that Saul was extremely tired. Okay, because again, it was a long battle. And then there's this scene that happens on Mount Gilboa. Okay, and we get a second version of this. The next time we meet, we'll get a second version of this. Okay, but the gist of it is it doesn't end well for Saul. Saul said to his armor bearer, "Draw your sword and run me through, or these uncircumcised fellow will come and run through and abuse me." Saul realizes it's over. Okay, so I mean, this is a sad moment. Saul had a lot of promise, but he realizes that's it. It's not going to end well. Maybe he knows at this point that his sons have died. Okay, but he says to his armor bearer, the guy behind him, the guy that would carry his sword, carry his armor, dress him, say, "Run me through with your sword." Okay, so Saul may or may not be mortally wounded. He asks his armor bearer to kill him. But the armor bearer was terrified and would not do it. Why not? Well, you don't just go around killing the king. Okay, again, remember what David had said to his nephew. You don't just go around hurting the Lord's anointed. Okay. Now the ironic thing, or I don't know if interesting thing is in the past, who had been Saul's armor bearer? David. This was a job that David had held. Now at this point, I don't think David would have been Saul's armor bearer, but this was a position that David had held. Okay, so maybe there's some, symbolism there. I don't, that might be overreading it. But the armor bearer was terrified and would not do it. So Saul took his own sword and fell on it. Okay. So the argument that Saul is not critically wounded means that, okay, he's got the strength to kill himself. Now, I mean, I don't know how much strength it takes to fall on a sword. This is one of those facts of life I have no intention of ever finding out. Okay. But he's able to place the sword in such a way that he can fall on it. I think one way of translating it is as threw himself on his sword to kill himself, and he kills himself rather than face the army of the Philistines. And when the armor bearer saw that Saul was dead, he too fell on his sword and died with him. Again, this is just my speculation, but I think this happens at the same time that David is beating the Amalekites. So while David is realizing God's protection, Saul is seeing the fulfillment of his failure, or what the lack of God's protection has done to him. So Saul and his 3 sons and the armor bearer and all his men died together that same day. Okay, this is not a great day for the kingdom. Okay. When the Israelites along the valley and those across the Jordan saw that the Israelite army had fled and that Saul and his sons had died, they abandoned their towns and fled. And the Philistines came and occupied them. Okay, so the loss was so big, was so obvious that people in the area said, "We got to get out of here because the Philistine army is coming in." Okay. The next day, when the Philistines came to strip the dead, they found Saul and his 3 sons fallen on Mount Gilboa. So they find the bodies in close proximity to each other, which kind of goes back to the support that Saul knew or could see that his sons were dead, which made him think that, okay, it's over for me. It doesn't appear that the Philistines realized that he was dead. They said they found him. Okay. The next day when the Philistines came to strip the dead, they found Saul and his 3 sons fallen on Mount Gilboa. They cut off his head and stripped off his armor, and they sent messengers throughout the land of the Philistines to proclaim the news in the temples of their idols and among their people. It's interesting that the writer makes this note that the Philistines are proclaiming this in the temple. This would include the temple we read about in chapters 4 through 6, where the Ark of the Covenant had gone and Dagon and the head fell. Now, a few years later, hey, guess what? Remember that ark that was in here? Well, Because when a king died, it was believed that the God of that king had been defeated. So my guess is there's somebody saying, okay, who's dead now at that particular Philistine temple? That's just my opinion. He asked his armor bearer to kill him. The armor bearer refused. Who else? It had been David. Saul ends up falling on his sword, i.e. killing himself. When Israel hears of this rout, they abandon their towns and flee. The Philistines find Saul on Mount Gilboa. They decapitate him, take his armor, announce his death in the temple, and fasten his body to a wall. They realize who he is simply because, he's his armor, his robes, the fact that he's got a sword, the fact that he's got an armor bearer, maybe he's got a banner there. Somehow or other, they know that's Saul. Okay, they know who it is. They take him and they take his son's bodies, and they pin the bodies up, which is something that was fairly common. You hang the bodies up, put the bodies in a cage and hang them up, or put them on heads on a spike or whatever. They put his armor in the temple of the Ashtoreths and fastened his body to the wall of Bethshan. Now there's this little coda, I guess, at the end of the story. Okay, there's just this little story that kind of goes back to Saul's very first event. Remember in chapter 11, Saul is made king, and he goes back and he's plowing, and they get a message from the town of Jabesh Gilead that says, I believe it's the Ammonites are attacking. Remember, Saul kills an ox and sends 12 pieces of meat out, and everybody calls everybody to gather to him. And Saul takes an army and over to Jabesh Gilead, has this great victory and rescues the people of Jabesh Gilead. Now, why aren't the people of Jabesh Gilead with Saul? I don't know. That's a good question. I mean, to me, it's a good question. But when the people of Jabesh Gilead heard what the Philistines had done to Saul, because again, word travels, right? So these guys are 35, 40, 50 miles away, but they heard what happened. It says, the valiant men marched through the night to Bethshan. Now, is there a battle? Maybe. It says, they took down the bodies of Saul and his sons from the wall of Bethshan and went to Jabesh, where they burned them. Then they took their bones and buried them under a tamarisk tree at Jabesh, and they fasted 7 days. Okay. The valiant men of Jabesh Gilead marched through the night to retrieve the bodies of Saul and his sons, bury them, burn them, and then bury them. And I think this is just done so that the Philistines can't find the bodies and put them back up somewhere. Okay. And then they fast 7 days. Okay. This is why 7 days? Why not 3 days? Why not 30 days? We don't know. This is just something that they were doing. It's a religious. But this is the day after. So I think this is about this time Saul dies. Saul is discovered dead. David is back at Ziklag. He's recovered everything. He's sending meat out to the people. Okay. And then we're going to find out the next time that somebody travels to meet David and tell him what happened to Saul. And we'll see what happens to that person the next time we're here. Okay. Any questions? Thus endeth the life of Saul, sitting on the ground telling sad stories of the death of kings. Okay. And down at the bottom, David recovered everything the Amalekites had taken. Again, so I think that, I don't want to spiritualize the text here, but the principle or the lesson here is that God, can protect what he wants to protect, whether we're there or not. Okay. David did nothing to protect he didn't leave a guard, but God took care of them, because normally they would have just killed everybody and destroyed everything. Okay. That was kind of the norm, but the king is dead. Long live the king, right? Isn't that how it goes? That will probably be the lesson title the next time. The king is dead. Long live the king. When I return, first Sunday in April. Well, thank you very much. I appreciate it. And if you have any questions, let me know. See you guys.